Hello everyone, thank you so much for having me. Thanks in particular to Professor Strider and Professor Goldman. It's really an honor and pleasure to be here. I'm a little bit out of my comfort zone in some ways, and already hearing some of the discussions that have taken place. I'm very excited for the discussion afterwards, but I'll try to keep to my paper for now, and then we can come to those issues later. I think it will be too much to try to address them off the cuff. So this paper is part of a larger project examining the position of music and politics in post-apartheid South Africa. As an important contemporary experiment in non-racialism, South Africa provides us with a particularly useful point from which to think about contemporary entanglements of space, aesthetics, sound, and power. The present paper is based on intensive fieldwork with non-professional popular musicians in Soweto, South Africa's largest urban ghetto and formerly a key site of anti-apartheid activism. During my research, I was constantly struck by how utterly immobile most of these musicians are. And I was struck too by the specific reasons for this immobility. Reasons, I must confess, that took me some time to fully comprehend. This paper offers some reflections on the ghetto in contemporary South Africa. It also emphasizes that these conditions of confinement, immobility, and spatial articulation are particular to democratic post-apartheid South Africa. So as noted in the written paper, there are various levels or registers at which Soweto operates as a space of exclusion. First, many residents of Soweto are confined to the townships themselves, and this largely because of lack of transportation, money or money for transport. Lack of transportation or money for transportation. Second, they are confined to particular townships within Soweto, and this primarily because of the material construction of Soweto, which was designed during apartheid to make internal circulation inefficient. Third and last, musicians in Soweto, my main focus, are confined to their houses, largely because of the ubiquity of household theft. So these three registers are somewhat scalar in the sense that they move from macro to micro. However, these registers are not simply related in terms of scale, precisely because the political and social dynamics that constitute each register are so different. In this presentation, I'm going to proceed in roughly the reverse order of the written paper, and I will spend more time on the micro practices of music activity than on the large-scale geopolitics. In particular, I'll be speaking about a particular group of musicians in a particular township of Soweto and about their immobility or sedentariness. So I'll begin with the ethnographic vignette, talking about a friend and interlocutor, a non-professional musician named Sizwe Mia. Sizwe seldom leaves his home because, as he's told me many times, he needs to protect his musical equipment. He often expresses frustration at this situation, usually by stating with simple resignation, "I am always here." Wary after several attempts to lure him away from his home so that his belongings could be easily appropriated, Sizwe purchased a fierce German shepherd and subjected the animal to a ritual surgery known as Kipa Isibungu, or cutting out the worm. Biomedical science would understand this as the removal of the cartilaginous structure under the tongue of the dog. And the point of this operation, which is quite common in South Africa, is to transform the dog into a permanently enraged beast. Western science has bequeathed to the worm-like structure under a dog's tongue the name Lissa, that is, the name of the Greek goddess of rage. There is thus an extremely widespread, layered, and even ancient history of associating this small chunk of connective tissue with ferocity. But while the Roman naturalist Pliny recommended the extraction of the Lissa as a protective measure against rabies, in Soweto, cutting the worm out from under the canine's tongue is intended to induce rabies-like symptoms, if not the virus itself. I shall refrain from entering into a discussion of how exactly to interpret this expression, of what epistemological apparatus is necessary to adequately and sensitively understand the expression as true. But I will nonetheless attest to the savage nature of this dog and its effectiveness as a protection device. So in Soweto, people are so eager to protect their belongings that they willingly live alongside monsters of their own creation. And this sense of constant threat is not limited to a person's worldly possessions. On the contrary, the anticipation of imminent danger extends to a person's very person. In other words, of great concern to Sowetans is the security of both things and people, of things and human body. In light of the rampant sexual violence that haunts South Africa today, it is clear as well that the distribution of vulnerability and danger is intensely gendered. But I want to return to Sizwe and to the fact that even today he only hesitantly and briefly leaves his house because he is concerned about the theft of his belongings, and most importantly is his computer, a device that not only makes, produces, and generates music and musical affects, but that also stores vital information. What does Sizwe's very extreme sedentariness say about a person's relationship to things, about private property, and about techne? For one thing, I believe, it implies that a musician's computer is almost a kind of prosthesis. It exists as a veritable extension of his or her body. In the absence of rigorous state protection in the form of police, and with the deregulation of monopolies over the means of legitimate force, people tend to relate to their property directly. In other words, private property is seldom mediated by the force of law. Instead, there is an unmediated relationship between a person and a thing, where the thing is owned through physical use. Thus, Sizwe can only be certain that a thing, such as a computer, is in his possession for the duration that he is actively engaging with it. The moment he leaves his room or even falls asleep, his relationship to property disintegrates. Now, this situation is even more extreme since property is often pried from individuals through robbery and mugging. In these situations, too, things have a prosthetic quality. Since a thing belongs to an individual only when it is somehow attached to the human body, for example, when it is in a pocket or grasped tightly in the palm of a hand, that thing is configured as an extension of the body. Things, then, do not belong to citizens in the form of private property as much as they belong to human bodies that grip onto things or else protect them with physical force. But it's important as well to note the dialectical opposites, because although people in Soweto go to extreme measures to safeguard their belongings, they often lend things out easily, without a second thought. In fact, people do not only lend things out easily, they often freely give them away. The reason for this apparent contradiction is actually quite simple. Lending is a social obligation. In his ethnography of Soweto, the anthropologist Adam Ashforth notes that people survive because others feel obliged to share and support them as members of their families, as neighbors, and as friends. There is almost a ubiquitous assumption, in fact, that resources will be distributed equitably and according to need. This does not mean that people lend things or give them away happily or unbegrudgingly, but it is uncommon to refuse a genuine request if that request can be reasonably met. So on the one hand, property is treated as a kind of bodily prosthesis, but on the other hand, a person's relationship to his or her property is understood as fragile, provisional, or temporary. A Sowetan might guard a phone, a hard drive, or a wad of cash with her life, but then only a moment later give all these things away without a second thought when a friend knocks on the door and makes a simple request. The giver might depart with her belongings begrudgingly, but she will usually depart with them nonetheless because she knows, or at the very least trusts, that she will receive the same treatment at a later date. To use Mausian terms, we could say that in Soweto, every gift impels a counter-gift. In terms of information storage on computers, the situation is extremely delicate. On the one hand, there is always the threat that computers will be stolen. And furthermore, musicians are obligated to lend storage devices such as external hard drives and memory sticks to their friends. But external hard drives are not plentiful in Soweto, and it is more common, in fact, for people to lend hard drives from their own computers, or even to lend the computer itself. For example, Sizwe removed the chassis of his desktop computer years ago, and I have the photo here that's in the paper, but here you can see the computer. There's no covering, and the hard drive is removed directly from the computer to lend it out. So when a friend wants to copy information from his computer, or when Sizwe wants to transport information, he removes the hard drive from his computer. There were many days that I arrived at Sizwe's house to make music, only to find that a friend had borrowed his hard drive for an undetermined period of time. When storage technologies are lent to friends and then to friends of friends, they often get lost along the way. Furthermore, hard drives are more susceptible to theft when they are being carried about than when they are at the home of their owner under his or her watchful eye. Finally, hard drives that circulate among an always expanding network of people are liable to break or get viruses. Thus, recording and not only performance is transient. The archival impulse is replaced by the inevitability of continual loss. To live in South Africa, write Nuttall and McGregor, is to be subliminally primed for major loss. In a place where the accident has become normal, music production has become a form of pure mediality, a process of means without end. Now, most of the theoretical frameworks developed by scholars of media and communications are only helpful in contexts where technology works at its optimum. However, as Brian Larkin reminds us, and I quote, "Technology influences through its failure as much as its successes. The inability of technologies to perform the functions they were assigned must be subject to the same critical scrutiny as their achievements." Close quote. Larkin emphasizes that failure and breakage often have generative as well as negative effects. Hence, although I've been describing technology use in Soweto in terms of difficulties and problems, the township context also enables alternative aesthetic forms. For example, it is not uncommon to lend a hard drive to a friend and have it returned weeks later with a wealth of new movies, photographs, and instrumental tracks. These photographs may be of unfamiliar faces and the tracks of unknown origins, but the person in possession of the hard drive often adds new layers to the tracks and then lends the hard drive out again, setting in motion the process of musical accumulation once more. In this way, the failure of smooth information transmission generates a particular cumulative creative practice that otherwise would not exist. So in the spoken version of my paper, I won't really have time to address the other two scales, but allow me to briefly mention them here. First, there is the issue of immobility between townships within Soweto. During apartheid, the townships were built in a highly structured way, but their layout was intentionally extraordinarily inefficient. So there's a picture from around 1960 of Soweto. Hope you can see it. You can see just how carefully constructed it was. And here's a picture I took a couple months ago. You can still see the same structure, but a lot of other things have happened. So for the security of the regime, roads were constructed to make internal circulation difficult. All major roads led directly to centers of employment or retail. Within the townships, roads circle, stop in dead ends, and make travel generally quite frustrating. In fact, circulation within a single township is not always particularly difficult. However, to move from one township to the next, even when the townships are directly adjacent to each other, is often extremely cumbersome and frustrating. So I put these in the written version as well, but here's just an example of how far one has to go to travel actually a very short distance. That's a river in between, and then there's another example. So A.J. Christopher summarizes the spatial logic in his Atlas of Apartheid. I will quote at length. The urban planning guidelines propose that group areas be drawn on a sectoral pattern with compact blocks of land for each group, capable of extension onwards as the city grew. Group areas were separated by buffer strips of open land at least 30 meters wide, which were to act as barriers to movement and therefore restrict local contact. Accordingly, rivers, ridges, industrial areas, etc. were incorporated into the town plan. Links between different group areas were to be limited, preferably with no direct roads between the different group areas, but access only to commonly used parts of the city, for example, the industrial or central business districts. During apartheid, this layout was designed to keep members of different ethnic groups apart from each other, and I think this is maybe a part of a conversation we could have later. I didn't go into it as much as I would have liked to in the paper. And although South Africa has changed politically in substantial ways since 1990s, the basic layout of Soweto still exists today, and that's something I discussed in my paper. So the sort of material conditions of urban life, that scaffold still remains, and it's still affected in some ways. And then the final scale that I talk about in the paper is that Sowetans are marginalized both politically and geopolitically from both the city center of Johannesburg and from the northern suburbs, which are today the commercial center of the region. I won't say much about this, except that it's entirely problematic to speak, as many cultural theorists do, about mobile fluidity in the post-apartheid period. In fact, the situation is in some ways the exact opposite, where most township residents hardly ever leave their township of residence, even though they are, of course, free to do so. So some final thoughts. In the paper, I've attempted to elucidate some of the social and geopolitical dynamics of immobility in a country vaunted for its half miracle. Immobility and spatial exclusion in the South African context are intimately linked to the production of space, to the security of the body, and to the problematic of private property. The disturbing aspect, of course, is precisely how little and yet how much this context resembles the most extreme cases of confinement, such as camps. But can we say that Sowetans are oppressed, that they are being confined by some ruling class, that some ruling class is confining them? Or is it not a situation closer to what Hannah Arendt described when she famously said of refugees that the problem is not that they are oppressed, but that nobody even wants to oppress them? Taking Arendt's writing as a point of departure, Achille Mbembe compares regimes of value before and after apartheid. During apartheid, he argues, black life was treated as both indispensable and expendable. Because labor power was necessary for the machinations of the apartheid state, black bodies were highly valued. Paradoxically, however, black life was seen as excessive and constituted wealth that could be lavishly spent. In the post-apartheid period, a different type of superfluity has emerged. Today, black life is no longer indispensable. Instead, high unemployment rates suggest that there is what Mike Davis would call a surplus humanity. In order to understand the South African situation, then, old notions of sovereignty, freedom, biopolitics need to be replaced by a theory capable of accounting for those who the state would rather not count, those who are excluded not by force or decree, but by a practice of indifference. But Michael Denning warns us that to speak repeatedly of bare life, superfluous life, these metaphysical extravagances, can lead us to imagine that they really are disposable people, not simply that they are disposable in the eyes of the state or the market. And this is why, in my mind, it is necessary to address particular practices of exclusion, immobility, and confinement. The study of musical practices helps us understand how mobility, immobility, security, and value are being reconfigured in the global South in often unanticipated ways. Thank you.